You're watching the New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
Since its inception, Amazon Web Services, AWS, has been the best place for customers to build and run open source software in the cloud. AWS is proud to support open source projects, foundations, and partners.
Welcome, everyone, to the Clipper. Nice nautical theme for KubeCon. So glad to have you here. I'd like to just introduce myself. I'm Alex Williams. I'm founder and publisher of the New Stack. We've been covering this space a little bit over the years. So I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much, Amazon Web Services, for having us. I want to invite Eswar Bala, Director of EKS, AWS, on stage. There you are. And Kelsey Hightower. So we're going to take a seat here. Eswar, I was checking out your LinkedIn page, and you're an Oregonian. You went to Oregon State. Your open sourcers go way back.
Yes. So I did my master's in Oregon State.
Ah, okay.
And I moved on to Seattle after that. I didn't even Seattle ever since. Yeah.
Well, there you go. And Kelsey, the story I remember about you is how you managed comedians in Atlanta. That being before I knew you in the Kubernetes world. Did you learn anything from there that kind of has helped you in your work? I imagine that has helped quite a bit.
Managing people who are paid to be funny is a whole different vibe. I happen to be funny sometimes.
Okay.
But usually I don't have the courage to write a joke into a keynote. It just has to happen.
It has happened.
From the audience feedback. But the thing I think I've learned the most is pay attention to the audience because they're half the performance.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So I want to talk a little bit about each of your stories in open source and how you got started in it. And for me, we covered open source. That kind of was the big foundation for what we believe was going to be instrumental in helping readers figure things out. Because for at-scale development, deployment, management, open source is just critical. So what about yourself? 2014, we saw the emergence of Kubernetes, and it's just been like a steam train ever since. What did you learn in those first years? What was it that you were doing at the time that gave you a sense of what was to come?
2014, it feels like yesterday, and also like that ago, right? So interesting times. I was fortunate to be in the container space since very nascent beginning of Docker as a tech. And Kubernetes came out in 2014, right? But before that, I was building a container orchestration system. A lot of us were playing in that space. Mesos was there, right? And the Borg and the Omega papers were available. So I had an opportunity to build a container orchestration system based on Borg and Omega papers. And I did that. And 2014 came, and this was my time before Eswar. And 2014 came, and Kubernetes came out in the picture. And I was there the very first meetup that Brendan Bunce did in Madonna Pictures. Right, I was there in the meetup okay, so here's Kubernetes. It's getting announced. Again, Borg and Omega are the predecessors for that system as well. So I was curious in what ways the systems that I designed overlap with Kubernetes. And I was blown away by what I saw, right? And so obviously there are so many commonalities, right? The idea of replication set was there. And I think the features were primitive, but the thing that blew me at that time was the thing we take for granted today. For example, flat network space, the service discovery built in, right? All these features were spectacular. Obviously, like a collective set of processes sharing a bunch of namespaces. And that was pretty unique as well, right? So I was blown out, and I had the opportunity to come back, evaluate build these systems, and throughout the systems that we had written, and replaced it with Kubernetes. And that was my first foray into Kubernetes. And given the features were lacking, I had the opportunity to build features like daemon set, like we called it singleton at that time, right? Load balance integration. That was introduced later, right? Like, so some of the ideas we played around, like we had a thing called App Store. So it's amazing to see some of these evolve into Kubernetes and down all of these tech right now. So in 2016, I came to Amazon. And in my first 6 months, I was in ECS, Amazon's homegrown container system. I had an opportunity to go out with an open source framework called Blocks. And the idea of Blocks was about enabling a framework so customers can build their own tooling. Like, think about if customers want to write their own scheduler, you'd be able to write it using that particular framework, right? So that was an experiment. It was a good one that we had a lot of learnings. After that reinvent in 2016, so Deepak Singh, who was my boss at that time, came in and said, hey, what do we do with these Kubernetes, right? And the reason why we asked that question to ourselves is, even though ECS was there and it was a widely adopted system, we had many customers reaching out to us and telling us that, hey, look, I'm running this problem with Kubernetes. Can you help us, right? And that was a signal that we used to measure okay, there's quite a lot of interest in Kubernetes, and I had the opportunity to work on the peer FAQ, collaborate on it, get the service started, right? And that's my journey so far.
Your journey in 2014, were you at CoreOS by that point, or were you at Puppet?
So, if I told you the journey in 2014, it won't make any sense. Because 10 years before that, I got into open source, probably like a lot of people here, then go to college. You look at the job postings for the big enterprises using the Solaris boxes, the AX mainframe, you can't even afford to learn how those systems work because you got to buy software to get the manual. So you can't even get in. And back then, there's these stores in the US called CompUSA. And you could go and buy a Linux magazine, and in the back, there's the CD-ROM. And the CD-ROM has this open source software. And as someone who didn't know what to do with their career because you're working fast food and whatever job that was within driving distance, in the back of that, you get this operating system, and you're asking yourself, if Windows is like $200 a pop, how can you give this away? And you start to look at some of the enterprise job openings, it's like, hey, we're looking at this Linux thing, so the job postings went from AIX Solaris to or Unix equivalent. And it's like, well, how do you get the Unix equivalent? Then you start to learn about the Richard Stallmans and the Linus Torvalds of the world. And there's this David and Goliath story that's unfolding. So for all the kids that didn't go to college, for all the people that didn't have someone they knew that worked in tech, this was your end. There was no permissions, no job interviews required. You can just show up and start contributing. So I get that Linux magazine, I'm learning the skills, and I go for a job interview, and they started asking me all these Unix questions, and I couldn't answer them. Got super lucky. When an interviewer was asking me all these Unix things, like I've never used AIX in production. But I thought it was Unix or equivalent. Like, when do we get to those questions? And he's like, well, what Unix do you know? And I said, FreeBSD. And I looked down, and on his leg, he had the logo, the mascot, Beastie, of the FreeBSD. I was in there. Then it became this romance of like, my distro is better than your distro. And I understood that knowledge was accessible. So to me, open source is a way that you can take sovereignty over your own career. And then as we get closer to this 2014 thing, I worked at Puppet Labs, and I was an open source contributor before I joined Puppet Labs. Then I became an employee. When I saw the world start to change and Docker came out and I'm sitting at Puppet Labs, I thought we were the future. I thought configuration management and DevOps was going to be the end-all, be-all. But it wasn't, because another group of people somewhere else looked at our automation and decided it should have been another abstraction. And then Docker's born. And I look at this Docker thing, it's like it's time to leave Puppet Labs, and I find my way into the Go community first. It felt like Go was going to be the future. Why? Because Michio Hashimoto was switching from Ruby to Golang. Terraform is written in Golang. Docker is written in Golang. And eventually Kubernetes will be written in Golang. And so I'm at this company called CoreOS. We're building Etcd, we're reading all the white papers, and we're turning them into reality. So for me, open source went from a sharing of ideas, Unix competitors, to now we're building the next generation of products. We are setting the industry standards. And remember, 2014, it was clear that the cloud providers were the only people capable of building these big ideas, these big systems. I remember seeing S3 for the first time. This ain't NFS. The world was progressing. And so when I get into the Kubernetes world, what I saw was, oh, this is the type of system a system administrator would have built if they only understood how. We went from white papers to projects, and when I started committing to Kubernetes, there was no one checking for college degrees. There was no one asking what systems I worked on before. And I was able just to earn commit access in the early days. And then I remember being on those stages, just being excited about my trajectory through that timeline and how Kubernetes felt like the end game for system administrators and the work that I was doing. And I remember when we started Kubernetes KubeCon, before CNCF existed, we created these communities for the people who were building things and felt like I felt. And the way I'll wrap this up here, I remember when Kubernetes started to really take off, two things that happened. I'll tell the Amazon linkage, but two things that happened that was really important. We started to get some adoption from humble beginnings. People used to laugh at Kubernetes because we had like a 30-node limit, because it didn't scale. Then it became 100 nodes, and we kind of knew we were on the way. But it became clear that we were going to probably surpass Mesosphere, or Mesos at the time, which is another open source project, but didn't quite catch on. And I remember someone went online and said, Kubernetes is killing Mesos. And I told that person, that's not what we're doing here. Different companies, same thing. We've all had these particular challenges, and then we have this thing where we can create a welcoming place for everyone, including the competitors. And I'll do the Amazon tie-in. So now I'm at Google, and now Kubernetes becomes a business. So my venture into open source has nothing to do with business. It's this ability that even the small person can build a thing that even the big business decides they should do too. So we're sitting at Google, and it's pretty successful. The CNCF is created. Brendan Burns goes to Microsoft, and like they're in. And we're sitting there still like it's not official yet. Amazon, even someone that worked at Google Cloud, understood that they were the #1 cloud provider. Didn't have to be ashamed about it, it was the truth. And when they made that announcement, that they were going to support Kubernetes, EKS, it felt like we closed the loop on it, that the hardest thing to do in open source isn't to just make the software and give it away for free, is to get the rest of the world to lean into the idea. And so that phrase that people have is, some people have ideas, and some ideas have people. And when Amazon joined that stack of people, then I knew it was going to be around for a long time.
All those people who you met, you mentioned that, right, and kind of like in the last bit of what you were saying. Those are the people who then define the community, right? And they're the people who you started to work with, you started to engage with. You must still see these people today. I mean, you mentioned Brendan Burns. I mean, he's one of the people who really stands out, you know, who had a real leadership position. How do you see that happening today? You must continue to see these people show up at different times. It seems to me such a core and vital part of the education of the entire ecosystem, because people come with so many different expertises.
Yeah, I mean, when you meet them, it's the same as before, right? Like Kelsey was saying, when we went into the community, they were super welcoming. It wasn't because they didn't see us as competitive, and they were not open to our ideas at the end of the day, right? So my favorite aspect of the cloud native landscape is actually the community, the incredible community we have, right? And the fascinating part is the openness of the community. So when we engaged for the first time, right, like it was fascinating. What struck me was, you know, when people from different companies work together, almost always there's some corporate barriers that come in when we work together, right? And that was non-existent in this community, right? Like, so from the early days, you can see that people from Google and Red Hat, CoreOS, many of the startups were working, and then Microsoft and Amazon came in, and many other people came in. Like, all of us had equal footing to go and work together to solve a common problem. And that remains till today, actually.
So that community that you got to know pre-Kubernetes, and, you know, in the open source community, it seemed that there was a dynamic that happened in the 2014 through 2016, 2018 era that seemed to transform how we thought about open source, because there was a lot of people there who were all kind of working together. It was almost like a scaling out of the community. Do you see it that way or no?
There's two important letters to this equation. It's called VC. Venture capital funding at that time poured a lot of money into this infrastructure wave. So I think a lot of people get confused about how open source actually happens. We're not talking about LS, CD, and a bunch of Unix utilities. These are big systems. These aren't systems that you build by yourself and hope it catches on. These are systems that require expertise at every layer of the stack. And so in order to do that, you need people that can be full-time on it. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but I've been an open source maintainer of my own project, and it's really hard to work 24/7 for free. It's really, really hard. Telling people no over the weekend because you can't get to it, it's important. So when I think about our community, this community had a lot of well-paid developers building out this stack. And then once you bring in all of the startups that were funded, that had their own ideas, they all were given runway to try something new, reinvent the wheel, bring a cloud-native approach to existing things like observability. We saw Prometheus and OpenTelemetry come from that. So even though we anchored this stuff on Kubernetes, and the other part is I saw the other side of it. I was at Google at that time. I'm pretty sure you saw this at AWS. Like today, AWS has projects like Karpenter, for example. When you look at something like Karpenter, the thing that we like about this wave of community, the big customers are actually, the big vendors are part of your community. And one thing that they see is big problems. So if you work at a place like AWS, you're going to see every way to break Kubernetes possible. You're going to have demands from the biggest and the smallest customers at the same time. And the number one thing that you have to do is distill it down to buy versus build. What will my customers give me permissions to do? So you look at something like Karpenter, we need auto-scaling. Vendor X has a version of auto-scaling. Vendor Y has a version of auto-scaling. And I'm pretty sure you've been in this position. When we say community, sometimes we have to suspend the competitor component. I know this is odd. We're not all in like independent mobs trying to figure out how to take out each other. That's not what happens all the time. Underneath the covers, we call our colleagues and say, hey, aren't you building something in this area? Can we show you what we got? Do you want to build this together? And then the consensus thing happens again. And then we announce these projects. And sometimes you see our announcements, all the companies I work with, and you may think malicious intent. Oh, they're trying to take out the little guy. And the truth is, if you read beyond the surface, the little guy has never seen these kind of problems. And when we solve it, we got to solve it for 20 years. So when I used to work at big enterprise, when we decided to open source something, there was this other question. Are you going to maintain this for 10 to 20 years? And if the answer is no, then we can't do it. So when I think about community now, we're on the other side of this now. These people are being very mature because our brands are attached to this. This isn't just a side project. These are 20-year commitments. You can't ship these components without a 20-year commitment. Right? Aren't that a place that we deprecated something under 15 years? Oh, another one's killing you. Like 15 years of free software needs to be 100. And so I do appreciate that we have the grassroots part of our community, but I also appreciate the big vendor part of our community because I really enjoy getting paid to work on the stuff that y'all got to use.
There's a lot there. I mean, when you talk about the VCs and stuff, and but also the people who are starting projects who are maybe getting funded or they work for a big company. Each where I'm curious about that community. It's still pretty small. There's still a small group of people. How important is the buy-in? How do you achieve that buy-in for a project?
The way I look at it is the community is small and vast in certain ways. Like small because there's still core group of people, small core group of people that makes these really important critical decisions at the end of the day, right? It's vast because that's the kind of reach and impact the community has. And in an environment like this, and remember, right, like, so this community is still very interconnected. Many of us who work for different companies, being part of the community, we've actually developed friendships that have gone beyond the corporate set at the end of it, right? And that personal trust makes it super easy to collaborate. And the other part of this is, somehow the cloud providers are able to both compete for the customers and collaborate simultaneously, right? When AWS goes to the community, we can work without any real competitive pressure, right? Like, because the ideas are well received, well debated. Sometimes it goes our way, sometimes it doesn't, right? But the thing is, the personal relationships that we've actually developed helps each of us understand what the perspective the other side is coming from, and what are the constraints that they are actually working with, right? And what happens actually is, it's very common that if you're working with a collaborator from another cloud provider, it might be a former colleague, right? Like, we have many people from AWS here that have been in other parts, and we all end up working with each other at the end of the day, right? So now coming back to buy-in, I think the buy-in portion still remains the same, right? It's fundamentally driven by, is there a clear value that we're providing to the customers, right? Number one. And is it broadly applicable to the people in the ecosystem, right? Like, not only selective cloud provider use cases, right? And most importantly, can we build a sustainable community, right? Like, and I think those three key parts are still very relevant in the conversation.
But there's still also the buy-in among the major providers, right?
You know what? When I was working in cloud, I was really nervous that we were going to go back to mainframe. Because most cloud platform systems were straight up proprietary. I did not see the light at the end of the tunnel. The first glimmer of hope I got was maybe the S3 protocol became an industry standard. Maybe some of the lawsuits around can be copied interfaces or not, but it was really nice when we learned that you can actually copy interfaces so we can get standardization, at least at the protocol level. But one thing I also noticed that a lot of you are probably cloud customers. And I think the cloud customers, or the customers in general, figured out one thing. You have a lot of sway in what happens. When you go to your favorite partner and you say, hey, we really would like Kubernetes. We're not writing that check unless we get Kubernetes. And if you've ever owned a product at a cloud provider, that is the ultimate consensus builder. Right? I can have an idea, you can have an idea, but if I talk to 30% of my customer base and they start asking for the same thing, or it becomes a technical deal blocker, the terms we use for that kind of thing, you end up having a lot of sway over what happens. And so I think there's a forcing function that's not just the cloud provider getting in a room and getting consensus. What I've seen play out is when the individual customers are saying similar things. And I think the CNCF in general help customers have a shared vocabulary. They will show up and say, hey, I love Datadog, I like your stack, but we're really interested in open telemetry. And it's not about avoiding lock-in most of the time. I know that gets thrown around a lot. The only thing worse than lock-in is lock-out. It's when the whole industry changes in a way where the person you decide to get locked into can no longer help you embrace any of that. Because they're just either too far behind, or they don't believe in an offering. So I think people have now found that open protocols are the way forward, and I think customers have done a lot of good work to get into a shared consensus.
So when you're talking about new projects that you're seeing out there, that we're seeing out there from AWS, you're starting to really start to push them out a lot faster than I can recall. You have Crow, you have Cedar, and Karpenter, right? And these are like three recent projects. Plus, there's open search out there, which has been around for a little bit longer. How do you decide what to invest in?
You know, it's been an interesting journey for me, right? Like, the open source strategy in Amazon is evolving, right? Because we are learning as part of this process, like as we engage. And remember, right? Amazon contributes to open source very broadly, right? I'm going to specifically talk about the CNCF cloud here in this particular case. And the way, when we started EKS, we were sure that for us to be successful in the cloud native space, we have to collaborate well with open source, right? And when we started building, even before we launched EKS, we decided that we're going to open source the networking plugin that we created, right? Like, we hadn't launched EKS, that it's a fundamental portion. And we said, we're going to open source it because it matters that, like, for any customer on AWS using Kubernetes, we were still thinking about AWS at the point. Any customer using Kubernetes on AWS, they should benefit whether they use EKS or not, right? And that was the fundamental reason behind it. From there, our approach became a little bit more comprehensive, right? Like we are obviously looking at all the community started projects like AWS Load Balancer, EBS CSI driver. All of these existed before even EKS launched, right? So we then said we're going to go collaborate because it's part of our customer stack. And going back to what Kelsey says, customers care about these things. It's better than us having a competing project in the space. So let's first go and collaborate in those initiatives. And then we've actually grown to lead them, right? From there, we went deeper, right? Like for example, now we deeply contribute to etcd, Containerd, there are many other CNCF projects we contribute, right? But from there, we've evolved to in a position where we're creating some meaningful projects, right? And that's where Karpenter and Cedar and KRO, which stands for Kubernetes Use for Orchestration, comes into the picture. And these were fundamentally started. Like our main approach here is, do we have an ability to create value for our customers and especially when the standard doesn't exist, right? There's quite a lot of fragmentation, and we want to actually go build something to promote interoperability, right? And that's how we approach it these days. And even before we launched Karpenter, we actually went to the cluster orchestrator community. And we realized that, okay, so we are better off, and in fact, they recommended us that we actually go build Karpenter so that we can experiment and innovate on that front and see whether it has standing, it has legs to remain, right? And we proceeded to do that, and that's how things started. And likewise, Cedar, we looked at the authorization space, and we realized that the authorization programming language for complex cloud environments doesn't exist. And it's one of the reasons we designed that language, open sourced it, and we also open sourced the Kubernetes implementation for that, right? Like, so now you can use attribution-based access controls using Cedar, right? Like instead of defining hundreds of RBACs, you can simply state it in a single ABAC rule using Cedar, right? And where Crow comes into the picture is it allows you to create multi-resource context very easily. Right? And that's the goal for a Crow at the end of the day, right? So now you'll be able to define your infrastructure in a simple YAML-based configuration that groups together multiple concepts. Think about your web application. It could be using a message queue, and it could be using a database, and it could be using a running stateless services. All of these combined into a single resource that you can reuse everywhere in your stack. Right? And that's how we are approaching it.
So how do you see the AWS approach? What is distinguishing about it? How do you compare it to other open source efforts you see from other organizations?
Boy, I'm in my mind, I'm like, man, do I make the AWS marketing team cringe up a little? Because look, the elephant in the room, when you see a big vendor do something, you question the motives. Question the motives. The origins of open source is because we're fighting against the big vendors too. Like, you can't ignore that particular truth. So I've worked in big and small vendors, and so I think a lot of people are confused. They believe that there's some master plan where the executive team gets in a room and is like, what do you want to open source? It's the least of their worries. I think there's usually a problem that you hit. So in the case if I were to think about from afar the Amazon approach, in some cases, Amazon isn't number one. And that allows you to bring a level of humbleness to the equation. We did not invent Kubernetes, so therefore we can't dictate where the community goes. And so when you show up at the SIG, that's part of the equation. And so that allows enough humbleness to actually listen. And when you come in that way, it's less threatening. You're a guest here. You don't just come and drop off specs and leave. So that's a huge element of it. And so, as someone who's worked in the cloud business, I know where the demand for these things come from. I'm a customer, and I do not want to build this myself. I'm a customer, and I don't want to manage this myself. And if you're a company like Amazon, you've got to make a decision. Do we just add this to our offering and maintain it by ourselves? Or do we ask ourselves, what is the value of Amazon having another autoscaler in the game? Because here's the thing, if you don't have consensus, then your customer may come and ask for the thing you built and the thing the community built. This will happen to you. When I was at Google, I remember we had one idea of what MapReduce was, and the industry had a different idea of what MapReduce was. So while we were talking BigQuery, Bigtable, data flow, they were like, no, we want Hadoop, Spark, and this Mesos thing. And so now you end up supporting both. And these are big efforts to support both. So if you're at Amazon, you do the thing that you should do, which is, we're hearing this demand, you show up to the SIGs, what have you all been hearing? What are you building? What are you planning to do? So that way I can go make a calculated decision, because unlike S3 in 2010 or 2012, you're not making this decision by yourself no matter what. No matter how good it is, the moment you ship it, have you all heard of this thing called Hacker News? If you launch something, you got about 35 seconds before the industry lets you know how they feel about it. And it's like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you're like, where are people finding time to write 5 pages of feedback? And I think the feedback is so fast that you can't just throw out a thing and say, forget about it, because social media will remind you. So I think if I'm Amazon, the transparency here is, we built this because our customers asked us to. We're sharing it because we think it's the right thing to do. And then here's how you contribute. And to me, that is a net improvement over what we were getting 25 years ago from the big tech, which is, here's a thing, and here's how much it costs. Good luck replicating it. So I think Amazon does it out of necessity, if we're being honest. And then I think it comes down to execution. And I applaud you all when these projects start to cross that 5 and 10 year mark. Because when everyone stops paying attention, the thing you signed up for, you still got to work on it. And no one cares anymore, but you do.
Well, we're coming close to time, so I was just going to ask one more question. I'm curious about the people who are working on these projects, and how do you maintain this pace in open source projects, and what role does AWS play in making sure that these organizations remain healthy? Is it your own hiring? Are you looking for your partners to do, to hire more people and look for volunteers? I'm just curious on how this sustains itself, because what we've seen in open source is, a lot of questions about, how does it sustain? How does it evolve? So I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
For these 3 projects that we're talking about, I think the way we want to sustain it is first of all, us contributing and building in the community, right? For example, Karpenter. We felt really good when another cloud provider said, I'm actually going to implement Karpenter provider, right? So for example, Microsoft came to the party. And that was a validation for us that yes, there's a pair there, right? There's a customer value. They're hearing it. It again goes back to Kelsey's statement, customers dictate what all of the cloud providers actually do, right? And that's a validation. Same for Crow. We were spectacular that the 3 cloud providers are working together in that space, right? Both, all 3 of us, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, are collectively working that initiative to define standards for how do you actually bring in infrastructure, right? And dependencies in a very simple manner. And when we started these projects, we changed how we work in the open source community, right? Because we learned what being open means, right? We went from, we're going to publish and then announce to, we're going to develop in public, for example, right? We made sure that all of our design documents are debated out in the open with our customers before we actually did it. We made sure that contributing to this is super easy, right? For example, we have a really good set of first issues. The contribution docs are crystal clear. We have responsive maintainers who actually give good feedback. All of these are crucial in building that sustainable community at the end of the day. But beyond that, we also want to make sure that we have a diverse set of maintainers, so that it's not just driven by idiots. We truly want this to be community contributions, right? Which means if you're working with our partners, our customers, we actively encourage them to participate. And any of you interested, please come in and join us and help us build these projects.
So with this longevity question, what's your take on this longevity question? Because you talked a little bit about that before, and how these projects have to last, not just 15 years, maybe like 100 years. And so how do you see that with, especially with deep commercial interests that come in open source these days, like you were saying before?
Yeah, I think we have to constantly remind that there are real people that work at these companies. So I worked at Google, there's Microsoft, there's AWS, and we tend to try to pigeonhole my entire existence to those things. And that would be a mistake. There's a guy here, Phil Estes, I remember when he went from IBM, and he worked on some very low-level, yeah, there he goes. He worked on some very low-level container stuff, the non-sexy stuff, the stuff that makes your work stable in production. He spent time at,
which were critically important.
I mean, critically important, but they don't. These are not the top-line items that show up in all the fancy posts that always show up on the keynote stage. So a person like that is open source to the core. They choose where they want to work. Trust me, they can work at probably any company in the world, especially those that rely on this type of technology. So when someone finds their way at Amazon, I don't think people understand what actually happens. Those people continue to put their reputations on the line for the things that they believe in. The protocol shouldn't work that way, even though it may work that way for Amazon. We have to integrate with the rest of the world. I have credibility in those communities. I have earned commit access in those communities. You can't just show up and pay a check to get commit access. It has to be earned. And these people go from company to company, but that kind of remains. And then I think in some ways it's gotten a little easier because all you have to do is just step back. Like, don't be so demanding. You can't put everything that person thinks about into a Jira ticket. All of that stuff won't make it into sprint planning. You need to know that you're getting some benefit that's sometimes hard to articulate. But if you hire the right people, you gotta let them cook, or you're gonna starve to death. And so I think making sure that we allow these people to be authentically members of the community, and we've all learned enough because we've seen this dance enough times to know that if you make them disappear from the open source community, the thing you hired, you're only getting half the time.
Well, Kelsey, Eswar, thank you very much for your time, and thank you all for being here. This has been really quite an enjoyable conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.